Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much to the organisers for inviting me and my colleagues to at least entertain you for the next 40 minutes, 45 minutes or so. And we'll be dealing with really different aspects of biological markers, particularly for major depression. And this is the sort of area, the four major areas which I'm hoping to cover with you, starting with something which I hope you're all aware of now, the role of chronic low-grade inflammation as a major contributing factor to the pathophysiology of depression. And then go on and really talk a little bit about the impact of the inflammatory state on the brain and how that could possibly contribute to depressive disorders. And the main sort of centre of my talk is going to be on the third point, which is something many of us have been interested in now for a number of years, and that is the tryptophan-kynurenine pathway. To try and link together what the hypercortisolemia as a consequence of stress and inflammation associated with it does to the metabolism of tryptophan down a neurodegenerative pathway. And then lastly, make one or two suggestions about how some of the markers of this pathway might be useful in the future as predictors of therapeutic response. This will be continued, this particular aspect will also be highlighted to some extent by my colleague Angelos Fanaras in his talk. So, first of all, the evidence which we all have experienced in one way or another, and that is sickness behaviour. All of us have had infections, influenza, and so on and so forth, which have produced not only nausea and vomiting, which of course is part of it, but also some quite profound psychological changes. Effects on the sleep pattern, effect on the mood state, and so forth. And this, to some extent, is separate from the effect on the nausea and the vomiting and the high temperature. And of course, in the case of depression, one finds an overlap in many of those symptoms. I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that sickness behavior is depression. But what I am suggesting is as a consequence of the underlying genetic predisposition of the individuals, of adverse environmental impacts and so forth, a whole number of factors which are prelude to a depressive episode. And we now know that the end product very often is chronic low-grade inflammation. Now, the inflammatory change, of course, is not nearly as dramatic as we would see following an infection. And in fact, one normally does not find very major changes in body temperature and heart rate and so forth. Nevertheless, we do know that low-grade inflammation does occur. And this leads, ultimately, when it becomes chronic, not only to the changes in the mood state, but to a whole number of endogenous changes which are linked to it, including the production of endogenous neurotoxins, which I will talk about later, and an increase in oxidative and nitrogen stress. Now, when we've known for a very long time that there are a whole number of changes, of course, in some of the central neurotransmitters, and indeed we've tried to explain changes in mood state, particularly in terms of changes in noradrenaline and serotonin, and indeed the antidepressants, or I should say, after David Nutt's lecture yesterday, drugs used for the treatment of depression. Right, David? Did I get it right?
Very good.
It's a mouthful. Being very old and very old-fashioned, I will use the term antidepressants. And what antidepressants are supposed to do, of course, is to normalize to some extent these underlying monoamine changes. And lastly, a little bit on the consequences of this. Now, what is the evidence of inflammatory cytokines and psychiatric disorders? Well, there's actually increasing evidence from, for example, epidemiological studies, where one finds in particular two of the cardinal pro-inflammatory cytokines, interleukin-6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha, together with C-reactive protein, actually increasing during the initial appearance of the major depressive symptoms and remaining present for much of the time that those symptoms are in fact obvious. Now, if one looks also at chronic physical illness in which chronic inflammation plays a part, heart failure, cancer, diabetes, psoriasis, IBS, and so forth. Also, one finds a high proportion of those patients also develop affective symptoms, often depressive symptoms. And this again correlates with what we see in the serum pro-inflammatory cytokines. So this correlates with the actual symptoms of depression rather than the severity of the physical illness itself. So we can say there's, to some extent, a separation there between the physical symptoms of these non-psychiatric disorders and the underlying mental state. Again, the major problem now with obesity, which affects, of course, a lot of Europe and North America, there's a threefold increase if one looks at all the statistics in depression. And we now know, of course, that in the obese individual, that the white adipose tissue is a very rich source of pro-inflammatory cytokines, together with interleukin-8, leptin, and so forth. So that's some of the sort of evidence that we have. What's happened to this? It's not changing. Got it, okay. Now, if one looks more specifically at patients with major depression, there's a lot of studies. Many of these have been reviewed recently, over 40 different immune markers, most of them inflammatory markers related to the depressive state. And we now know that there's an increase in the peripheral, and now increasingly we've got evidence in the brain of patients, post-mortem material and so forth, from cerebrospinal fluid analyses of patients. There's an increase in these pro-inflammatory cytokines. So I think the evidence now is becoming, increasingly obvious. Some of our own studies included here in changes in acute phase proteins, increases in pro-inflammatory cytokines, increases in chemokines, soluble receptors, and so forth. So increasingly there's an interest in this area, and we can say that if we try and summarize all that, depression is characterized by aberrations in interrelated pathways, including not only the inflammatory pathways, oxidative pathways, reduction in antioxidants, but also something I want to touch on at the end is the long-term consequences in terms of the intermediary metabolism, particularly of glucose in the brain, because of the damage to mitochondria, leading to a reduction, particularly in energy generation from glucose. So, what about the connection with brain dysfunction? Well, we know that pro-inflammatory cytokines have a very important role in enhancing the release of glucocorticoids. They stimulate particularly the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So not only does stress do this, but also the presence of pro-inflammatory cytokines are in fact stress stimulants. The chronic hypercortisolemia, which of course is been remarked on for many, many decades now in major depression, enhances fat, carbohydrate and protein metabolism, and indeed leads to insulin receptor insensitivity, all linked as a consequence of chronic inflammation. And lastly, another consequence that I will show you later is a reduction in free tryptophan and free tryptophan and a reduction also in serotonin synthesis, which might be one of the important factors triggering the neurotransmitter changes. And these changes, again, are linked very much to the activation of the indolenyl-amine oxidase pathway, both in many, many organs, including the brain, and the tryptophan dioxinase in the liver. So, stress then activates tryptophan dioxinase, particularly in the liver, and also the pro-inflammatory cytokines activate a related enzyme, indolenyl dioxinase, in the periphery and also in the brain. This increases the conversion of tryptophan away from the synthesis of serotonin down the kynurenine pathway. And as a consequence, as I will show you in a second, there's an imbalance between the synthesis of the neuroprotective end product, kynurenic acid, and the neurodegenerative end products, 3-hydroxykynurenin and quinolinic acid. And in the case of major depression, it is the neurodegenerative pathway leading to the synthesis of 3-hydroxykynurenin and quinolinic acid, which predominates. This slide, I hope you can see it. It's not very clear. It was very clear on my machine, but anyway, what this basically shows is here we have tryptophan normally synthesized into serotonin. That pathway is relatively decreased in major depression, largely due to the activation of indolenyl dioxinase and tryptophan dioxinase, this by cortisol, this by pro-inflammatory cytokines, down to kynurenin. At kynurenin, the pathway splits, either going to 3-hydroxykynurenin and quinolinic acid, which is the pathway which is accentuated in depression, and not to the neuroprotective pathway to kynurenic acid. This is an antagonist of N-methyl-D-aspartate glutamate. This is an agonist, or a partial agonist, I should say, of NMDA glutamate. But I want to just point out to you another important thing, is that quinolinic acid is in fact an important precursor of nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, NAD, which is an absolutely fundamental cofactor in the electron transport system for the production of energy within the brain. This is a major source of NAD for the brain. The consequences of this pathway increasing, and in particular these two end products, this is a very, very strongly in its effect on oxidative stress. This, as I say, activates the NMDA glutamate receptors and is in fact ultimately to destroy, to reduce the activity of astrocytes. And astrocytes have a fundamental role to play in protecting the metabolism of neurons. But at the same time, there's an increased activation of the microglia. And so consequently, what we find is that, where's my thing gone? It's not coming up. There we are, yes. What we find is that there is a decrease in the astrocyte load and an increased activation of the microglia, which are producing yet more, locally, yet more pro-inflammatory cytokines. So you can see that once this pathway is accentuated, there are a whole number of consequences in terms of the enhancement and continuation of the inflammatory process within the brain. And as a consequence, possibly an increase in neurodegenerative changes. What is the evidence for this? It's all very well having the theory and showing one can exemplify this in tissue culture and so forth, but we also have evidence from suicide patients and the brain, and this is an example here of the accumulation of quinolinic acid in the brain of a group of depressed suicides, showing here in the microglia an increased intensity of the production, in particular, of quinolinic acid, and in fact the accumulation in neurons and so forth within the brain, and the destruction of those neurons. And so when we actually look again at the analysis, what you can see here in depressed patients is a reduction in tryptophan. Here you can see, if one looks at the ratio of 3-hydroxykynurenine to kynurenic acid, this increases, and if you have a look here at the kynurenic acid ratios, again, one has a very, very similar sort of change. So the whole thing seems to fit together with what we can find in the plasma and also in the brain of patients. So what happens then under physiological conditions? The major source of NAD is in fact this tryptophan kynurenine pathway. The activation of this pathway in chronic stress and depression leads in fact to a reduction in NAD. The reduction occurs because, of course, the quinolinic acid precursor is increasingly diverted now to the activation of NMDA receptors and not to the synthesis of NAD. Now the reduction also occurs in the transport of glucose into the brain because there's insensitivity of the insulin receptor, which is very much linked to these changes, and also an inflammation-induced mitochondrial dysfunction, which also is compounded by the reduction in the synthesis from NAD, which could have a major impact on brain metabolism and function. And so this again just sort of summarizes, I think, where we are. An overactivation of the N-methyl-D-aspartate receptor, a decrease in the NAD as a consequence of this particular neurodestructive pathway increasing in depression, and the neuroprotective pathway in fact decreasing in depression. And just to sort of summarize then, the changes in the astrocytes, increasingly destroyed by quinolinic acid. Under normal circumstances, kynurenine is shunted through to kynurenic acid, particularly by astrocytes. That protective pathway, to some extent, is lost in major depression. If one looks at the microglia, this is a rich source of 3-hydroxykynurenine and quinolinic acid, and of course reduction in NAD. And if one looks at the mitochondria, xanthonuric acid, which is part of that pathway, the neurodestructive pathway, and 3-hydroxykynurenine actually do attack the mitochondrial membrane, increasing the pores in the permeability of the membrane, and therefore decreasing the integrity of mitochondria. So this, I think, is encapsulated to some extent by a very nice concept of Peter's, the selfish brain theory of psychiatric disorders. I think we often forget in psychiatry that the metabolic aspects of the brain, it utilizes 20% of the oxygen and 50% of the glucose, and yet the brain, the body mass ratio, is only 2 to 3%. So this is a very greedy organ in terms of glucose utilization. So if anything goes wrong in the actual transport of glucose into the brain and its utilization in the brain, this ultimately is going to have a major impact, particularly on the neuronal integrity. And in major depression, there's an impairment of the insulin receptor signaling, which of course has a very major effect on reducing glucose availability, and of course the direct and indirect effects of chronic inflammation cause the insulin insensitivity, a reduction in the insulin receptors, and metabolic hyperactivity, which has been measured in the hippocampus, prefrontal cortex, and medial-dorsal thalamus, all of which we think have some relevance to depression. And that just brings that together diagrammatically. Dysfunctional brain glucose metabolism caused by inflammation, and is that in fact a major factor that we should consider when looking for a possible reason why pro-inflammatory cytokines are not a good thing if you're suffering from a major psychiatric disorder. So the important impact of the pathway in mental and physical health and disease suggests that the metabolites from the pathway could provide useful markers of depression and also predicting the response to treatment. And indeed, my colleague Amy Mint and her group in Munich and Magdeburg universities have been looking at this. My colleague here, Angelo Solaris, has also been looking at this aspect, and we'll say one or two things about it later. But it does mean that we need to look, I think, much more carefully at such metabolites in addition to the major metabolites of the inflammatory cascade as possible markers of depression and of response to treatment. And so looking now at the various factors which contribute to chronic depression. And what I think many people are now beginning to surmise is that possibly as a result of this, there's increase in neuronal apoptosis and decreased neurogenesis. There's an aging, an accelerating aging of neurons, and that these could be important factors, combined with the metabolic factors I've already mentioned, to dementia with some elderly patients as a consequence of depression. So then in summary, chronic low-grade inflammation is important in major depression. Hypercortisolemia or inflammation cause dysfunctional changes in the brain. The metabolic syndrome is a frequent consequence of these changes. The activation of the tryptophan kynurenine pathway by cortisol and inflammatory cytokines produces neurotoxic kynurenine metabolites and a reduction in NAD synthesis and mitochondrial dysfunction, which reduce brain metabolic energy. And so the question is, could the kynurenins provide a potential marker for depression and also response to treatment? And with that, I would thank you for your attention, and particularly wish to bring to your attention my colleague Amu Mintz from the formerly University of Munich, who has made over the last few years a major contribution, particularly to the work on the tryptophan kynurenine pathway, of which I was privileged to be associated for a few years. So thank you very much indeed for your attention.
Thank you, Brian. That was a very interesting talk. Do you have any question you want to ask? Please.
Sunum için teşekkür ederim öncelikle hocamıza. İki şey sormak istiyorum ben. Birincisi endofenotip değeri olarak inflamatuar markerların nasıl bir değeri olabilir? Bunu sormak istiyorum. Riski belirleme, predikt etme anlamında. İkincisi de eğer bir endofenotip çalışması planlanacak olsa inflamatuar ya da immün markerlarla alakalı, bunun için hangi akraba çeşitlerinden örnek alarak çalışmak daha mantıklı olur? Hastanın kardeşlerinden mi yoksa ebeveynlerinden mi?
Thank you for your question. The first, I think, for many years, I think many of us working in this field have been looking for biomarkers. If you think of cardiology, then of course there's plenty of biomarkers which tell us something about the integrity of the myocardium, etc., and which have clinical relevance. So far, in terms of any areas of major psychiatry, we've not found anything which really is going to tell us much about the severity, the time of onset, the duration, the response to treatment, and so forth. So we have to rely very much still on observation and what the patient tells you. I'm feeling better, I'm not feeling better, etc. So therefore, if we could find the equivalent of some fairly direct, simple biomarker which could be measured in the blood, urine, saliva, whatever, I think this would be a great help to the clinician, to the practicing clinician, in at least seeing whether there's a possible response to an antidepressant. After all, with the drugs we have presently, have to wait several weeks often before we know the patient is going to really start getting well. And I think it would be very, very useful to know if a marker can pick up some early change which would tell us this is the right drug for that particular patient. So I think that's what we're hoping for in terms of biomarker research, and we've been really doing this for many years. The second point, well, yes, if we do find a good biomarker, which tells us something about the actual patient with the illness and the response of that patient, then maybe that biomarker will tell us something about the underlying predisposition of relatives and so forth to that particular condition. At present we have nothing. Yes, there may be the sort of family links, genetic links and so on and so forth, but so far this has not been very useful in terms of telling us whether in fact the offspring of a patient with depression is in fact more vulnerable or not to that particular condition. So I think that it all hinges on finding appropriate biomarkers, and that's what I think many, many, many people in different countries have been trying to do this for years, so far fairly unsuccessfully. That shouldn't stop us looking. If cardiologists can do it and so forth, then I think those working in the area of cancer research can do it, then I think that's a challenge which those of us in biological psychiatry also should be facing and trying to improve. So that's the concept behind it. So far, not as successful as we would like.
Thank you. I think we better stop in here. And thanks again, Brian, for your very nice talk. Thank you. Do you have any questions?